podcasters good people?
Many of them are good.
Where is the nearest podcaster?
At the we work in Keene.
Do you know her?
There are many podcasters at the we work in Keene.
What's a WeWork?
Honestly, though,
Valid
bad
question.
business model based off of that documentary I watched. Welcome to Gom Jabbar, your guide to the iconic world of Dune. We'll be exploring the themes, philosophies, and characters found in the sandy depths of this vast universe, from Frank Herbert's groundbreaking novels to the adaptations on film and TV. My name's Abu.
My name is Leo.
And welcome back to Heretics of Dune, folks.
Yes, Dune.
We are continuing our journey through the fifth book in the Dune saga by Frank Herbert. What a wild ride it's been. And today's chapters, folks,
crazy.
They don't disappoint.
Banger chapters.
If you were getting bored of two people sitting in a room talking, these last two sets of chapters we've covered, it's been a good shakeup.
It's a reminder to go to rooftop gardens. It's a good time. It's always a good time. Before we get too into it, housekeeping. Let's make Shout Out Mapes proud.
Yes.
As usual, today's episode, no spoilers past the pages and books we've covered thus far. So if you are caught up on the book club, you're good to go.
That's right. And of course, a huge shout out to our Kwisatz Haderach level patrons, Rob, Silver, Daniel, Dion, Roman, Caballo, Jonathan, Lambert, and C.R. Spruill. When I look at your names on that list of Patreon supporters, I connect with my own humanity. It's oftentimes the only time I feel my humanity.
Yeah. The last time I saw Abu cry, he was just looking at the list of your names and a tear. He wiped a tear from his eye. It shocked me. I was like, oh my God.
Wild. Look, great art and great generosity can connect us all to the soul of humanity. And y'all achieve that with your Patreon support. But of course, I would argue all of our patrons at every level.
Totally.
Helps us all connect with our humanity more deeply. And we are so grateful for that.
Also, it helps us do the show.
That too, yeah. It
connect
does
with our
pay some
humanity.
bills.
Also make Gom Jabbar, for sure. No, but yes, thank you, everyone, for sure. Okay, well, today's episode, typical game plan. We are going to begin with a summary of the incredible chapters that we stumbled upon today. We will dive into a couple of takeaways, and then we're going to wrap up with a basically one spice morsel.
Right.
Before we get into it, though, we're going to take a quick break. So don't go anywhere. When we're back, we're jumping in to chapter 13.
Welcome back, folks. Let's dive right into our chapter summaries for today's reading, beginning with chapter 13.
Yeah.
So, in our first chapter, we are back on that lighter with Teg and Taraza and O'Drade and that Bene Gesserit squad on their way back down to Gamu. Now, while Teg and Taraza are talking, we're actually shifting towards O'Drade's perspective, who is only sort of half listening to this conversation happening over there, but even half listening for a Bene Gesserit is completely enough. She's still processing what's going on.
Yeah, they're perpetually on their phones, but they're always getting everything you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
They've mastered the art of multitasking. So O'Drade, with the half that she's not listening to Teg and Taraza with, is just sort of wool gathering, you might say.
Yeah.
She's thinking back, for example, to her very first seduction. We get some insight here into the Bene Gesserit training.
Yeah.
It was truly an eye-opening experience for O'Drade. She had, of course, gone through her training. She had worked with the training males on honing her sexual prowess and utilizing it as a tool like the Bene Gesserit do.
My God, quick aside, how do I apply for that job?
Right. What are the what exactly are the qualifications?
Where do I submit my application right now?
Indeed.com/ The thing though is having sex in a training capacity and having sex with a real person are two dramatically different experiences.
Yeah.
And the first time that O'Drade has this sexual experience with a man, it's harrowing stuff. Clearly, she still remembers it to this day, all these years later. She is now an experienced and veteran Reverend Mother. This was many years ago, and she still thinks about it and still remembers those feelings. No training could have prepared her for, frankly, how good it felt when her partner was just in it. You know, he was locked in, she was locked in. He was clearly desperately in love with her, and it showed all over his face. That was a scary feeling for her, and she was unprepared to tackle that in the moment. Quote, the look on her male companion's face, the sweet kiss, his total abandonment of all self-protective reserves, unguarded and supremely vulnerable. No training male had ever done that. End quote.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's also, she's like, I learned how dangerous love can be exactly as my trainers knew I would in that first experience. So it seems like this is also kind of a vetting process for breeding Reverend Mothers. Can you get through that first seduction? You're probably gonna feel the love, and then can you walk away from that?
Right.
Still
can you shut the valve quickly?
Yeah.
Or does it overwhelm you?
Yeah, I do get the impression from O'Drade and the way that she talks about things that she is uniquely still attached in some ways to her past. She talks about her like surrogate family and this breeding male. The fact that she still recalls his name and his like face still pop up in her memory from time to time would probably be seen as a weakness and a flaw.
Right. That's a good point. I think it's something she wouldn't openly be sharing with even Tar, even her best friend and older sister Tar. She would be like, I don't think about that guy
First
at all.
guy?
First who?
First guy. Wow, that's
was
way
his name
back.
Jim or Jack?
Driffius? I don't know. Something.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. I don't remember him at all. And, and secretly she's like, she has a drawing of him in her diary. Totally. But for us, this is really interesting insight into how the Bene Gesserit operate and how they're trained.
Yeah, totally.
But zooming back to the present, we're still in that lighter. Taraza is in the middle of a lesson, folks. She is trying to teach Teg something, and as we'll learn shortly, also impress this lesson upon O'Drade as well. She speaks about three things in particular. She talks about dependency infrastructures, hydraulic despotism, that doesn't have anything to do with water, and keylogs, that does kind of have something to do with water. These are three very fascinating, somewhat water-related concepts that we will return to later in the episode in our takeaways. So let's put a pin in that conversation for now and continue with the summary here.
Right.
As Taraza is talking, O'Drade realizes late in the game here that most of this conversation has also been for her, and that maybe she should have been paying more than 50% attention to what's going on.
Yeah.
And you had pointed out a really interesting note here. In the previous chapter, we talked about how Teg also realized that Taraza was teaching a lesson, sort of putting on a show, and he almost immediately picked up on the fact that this is for O'Drade.
Yeah. He was like 2 sentences in, and he's like, okay, this is for all of us. This is also for them.
Completely. It's just another example of this veteran Bashar, Supreme Bashar Mentat's mind at work, and how quickly he's able to tap dance with the Bene Gesserit, right? Most people in the universe cannot keep up with the Bene Gesserit.
Yeah.
Miles Teg clearly can. And even O'Drade here probably did a bit too much wool gathering and should have been paying more attention.
Yeah, 45 minutes into the lecture, O'Drade's like, oh shit, should I have my book?
I missed the first 4 slides.
I missed the slides. And they're not going to email it out.
You're not going to email it? What?
Oh, that's fine. I was paying attention.
Right. O'Drade is me in every college course I ever sat in.
Paying 50%. That's generous for me, but that sounds right.
Now, something we wanted to call out. In her lesson, Taraza brings up the honored matres. She's clearly building up to this point about the Honored Matres and trying to teach Teg and Odrade something. And once again, Teg very quickly understands the lesson and is able to compute what perhaps Teraza is trying to get across. Quote, "They can only survive if they continue to increase the dependency of those who support them. It's an addict's dead-end street. They could take much of humankind down with them." End quote.
Right.
Boom.
Yeah.
Teg gets the core of it. This is what Teraza is saying about the Honored Matres.
Right.
And we'll explore this a little more deeply when we talk about those three concepts later in the takeaways as well.
There's also a few moments where she says something and then Teg's annoyed and like, yeah, get to the point.
Mm-hmm.
And Odrade is like, that was what I was going to say. Like, why is she doing this? And I also see this as, this is Teraza introducing Teg and Odrade to one another without them having to directly interact.
Ooh.
So I see this as Teraza teaching Teg what she needs him to understand and giving him data. So she's teaching him a lesson. She's teaching Odrade a lesson and introducing Odrade to the modern Teg, this person that she will need to rely on and trust and know his extents and his capabilities.
Yeah.
And then she's also giving them opportunities to reflect on one another. It's so cool.
It's very cool.
Lessons within lessons.
Yeah. And this is true about this whole book. Everything has a surface level meaning. That's just the words on the page and the text that you're reading. And then there's, at minimum, like 2, 3, 4 more layers of what's actually happening in between the dialogue and the writing and the paragraphs. And I think you're spot on. That's just one more layer of what's taking place here.
Yeah.
Teg and Odrade being introduced to one another and immediately forming a sense of empathy and bond.
Super cool.
Now, to wrap up the chapter, the lighter approaches Gamu. We're about to land. It's really funny. It gets a little rocky at points, and Teraza is like seemingly getting annoyed that she has to be interrupted all the time by the turbulence. And I'm like, wow, I hard relate. But ultimately, we end on a discussion of the Atreides Manifesto. Teraza gives Odrade and Teg these orders to, once they land, to have a quick meeting to talk about this manifesto and next steps, to debrief. And we get a pretty significant hint about who wrote the Atreides Manifesto, which of course we learn very quickly in the next chapter.
It's true. Okay, chapter 14. So chapter 14, everyone arrives at the keep, and Lucilla and Odrade come face to face for the first time and are like, my God, we're identical.
It's the Spider-Man meme.
Yeah, just
it's the pointing Spider-Man meme.
We're all Atreides.
Oh, Atreides? You too?
Atreides?
You too?
Oval face? Wow. We're all Jessica types.
Hawk features?
Hawk features? Yeah, okay, cool. And, of course, a guard informs Teg, surprise, Shuang Yu, pissed. Super pissed that no one told her that the big boss was coming to town.
Sure.
Makes sense. Now, Teraza explains her visit's purpose to Shuang Yu, to the group. She says, I'm here to meet with Lucilla, and I'm here to observe Duncan for a bit.
Mm.
And at this point, everyone basically breaks off for their respective conversations. But as Teg and Odrade talk, Odrade basically drops 2 wild revelations to Teg. First, she's like,
oh my God.
First, she's like, I'm your daughter.
Oh, what?
But she doesn't just tell him that. No, instead, she's like, let me repeat back to you some words.
Oh my
You might
God.
remember some of these. And then fucking repeats back to him word for word, tone for tone, his exact words that he like whispered to a lover that he was laying in bed with, 50 years ago, 70 years ago.
Honestly,
years ago.
so rude.
Fucking crazy. What an insane way to do this.
Oh my gosh.
It's wild.
There's just got to be a softer way to land that, Why are we... That's insane.
It's just wild. Also, the implications of other memory. Again, it's like, Teg knows. He's like, oh, so you have memory of us banging. And
That's
you're
true.
my daughter. Ugh.
That's
Okay.
right.
Well, That is what it is. Anyway, should we shake hands? Like, what? Then we move on from this moment. And then she keeps the revelations coming, right? Because
here's a way to move on from this moment.
Yeah, here's a way. She's like, oh, you know the Atreides Manifesto? And he's like, yeah, that crazy document that I had to read because Taraza told me to. She's like, yeah, I wrote it.
Ah!
And he's like, what?
Oh my God.
I also, again, I like that one of his first reactions is, but the Tleilaxu are spreading it. And Odrade's like, yeah, that's our plan. We intended them to.
Yeah.
It's a super interesting revelation. Like, this manifesto coming at this time likely has to do with whatever expectations the Bene Gesserit has for the key logs, the dependencies, this building tension. They need people to be softened up a bit. They need faiths to be softened up a bit. This is how they're going to do it with this manifesto that they know the Bene Tleilax are going to spread far and wide.
Yeah. I agree. I think they would intentionally leak it. It would be like a Ryan Reynolds Deadpool situation where it's like, whoops, we leaked this like VFX test we were going to do, and it turns out to be amazing. Whoops, the movie got greenlit because everyone loved the thing we leaked. I wonder who leaked it. And it's like, we all know who leaked it, Ryan Reynolds. But
right.
Obviously there was a play there, and the Bene Gesserit are clearly trying to also get their R-rated superhero movie greenlit.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also wanted to comment, these two revelations I think are quite poignant and are timed so well. Frank, a master of his craft, of course, because I just talked about in the previous chapter summary Odrade's first seduction.
Yeah.
And we just learned this disconnected way that the Bene Gesserit are taught to mate with men, how they're taught to turn off their love at a moment's notice. It's all for a purpose. It's all for Bene Gesserit plans. Teg, of course, knows this as well. He's worked with and for the Sisterhood his entire life now. And you can definitely tell from his reaction and from some of the subtext here between Odrade and Teg that he's now thinking back on this woman who he thought he was in love with, who he thought loved him, and realizing, oh, she was just a sister, a Bene Gesserit sister, and she was just taking my genetics. It's fascinating to think that this would give Teg pause and maybe even make him consider, like, oh my gosh, has any relationship I've had not been controlled by the Bene Gesserit? Like, was any woman I was with actually in love with me?
Yeah. The impression I get throughout all of this is Teg really doesn't hold anything against the Bene Gesserit. Let's say he goes, wow, no one's ever loved me, truly. Or anyone who has loved me has done so in a removed, calculated way. I think he probably wouldn't be too bothered by that from the perspective of like the Bene Gesserit. Because I can't help but think back to his upbringing and how, in many ways, Taraza treats him as much as a Bene Gesserit as she is. I kind of get the impression he would get it. But it is a pretty shocking.
Interesting. I got the opposite impression because in this very chapter, he's like, I feel nothing for this daughter.
Yeah.
Which is a fair reaction. He didn't know he had a daughter,
right.
or that Odrade was his daughter. But again, maybe I'm coloring it with my own feelings on it, or placing myself in Teg's shoes and assuming he would feel the same way I do. There's definitely some bias I'm putting in there too. But from the words that Frank chose when we're in Teg's head and the way he feels about Odrade and the cold way, as we'll talk about, the way he's kind of like, oh, these Bene Gesserit aren't even human. Like, why is he having those thoughts if he's not feeling some sort of resentment? Like, wait a second, the fuck?
Yeah. Because also there's the moment where Odrade's like, this way you hold my arm right now as though you really were my daughter. You're right, is like, like it feels dripping with like almost venom, and
right.
like that's
venomous.
But she says, I am your daughter, but I'm surprised you think so little of us. And he says, quite the contrary, I stand in awe of you. And so I think he is removed emotionally from a lot of this stuff. And maybe that's his mentat qualities being hard for you or I to relate to as a reader. Like, I'm as a reader going, oh my God, I would be betrayed and I would feel all these emotions. And he's a mentat, and we can't even like put ourselves in those shoes.
Well, did you take that as in awe of Odrade? Because I took that as in awe of just the sisterhood and the way it operates. Because you can be in awe of something and still not like it or agree with it, you know?
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what our listeners think, because you're right. I fell sort of on the side of he's all very like calculating, and he's sort of like Bene Gesserit can do no
Business
wrong.
as usual.
Yeah, like even realizing that his mother had sent him away to training not because she loved him and was impressed by him, but because he's what they had been planning for,
Mm-hmm.
and only found out after she died. And then that moment, which could have been my mother, the person who I loved and trusted more than anyone, was just using me and was just planning for me to exist and didn't love me and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's a good
That
point.
moment, he's like, well, I still love the Bene Gesserit, and I
Right.
transfer my love to the Bene Gesserit.
Rather than being a moment of betrayal, it was a
Right.
moment of affirmation of his connection to the sisterhood.
But to your point, and maybe on your side of the dial, trying to keep both ideas in mind, he also is now a much older, more mature person who is not just being moved around on a chessboard. He is someone Taraza is not giving orders to. He is someone who is making choices on his own. So I also see the current Teg as someone who could stand apart from the Bene Gesserit and go, they're fucked up sometimes, and I don't like them, and I don't like those things that they do.
He is quite critical. We'll talk about it in the takeaways, but he's literally like these Reverend Mothers, they manipulate. Their like whole purpose is to manipulate everyone all the time, everywhere at once,
Yeah.
I mean, Miles Teg is by far, in my opinion, the most fascinating character in this book.
Yeah.
And certainly my favorite by a long shot. Okay, anyway, back to our summaries. We dovetailed into a fucking takeaway out of nowhere.
Oops. Yeah.
Classic. All right, chapter 15. Let's wrap up this summary. Chapter 15 is absolutely buck wild.
It's fucking crazy.
Frank once again turns that dial up to 12 out of nowhere.
Yeah.
We're back on Arrakis with High Priest Tuik, and our guy Tuik is having a rough time. He's dodging assassination attempts left and right. He's got to deal with unruly advisors like Styros, who are now sort of openly speaking against him. In fact, he just had a meeting with Styros that he's now reflecting back on, and that's how this chapter opens. We get a flashback to how badly this conversation went between them. Tuik and Styros' conversation is worth touching on here briefly, because there are some very interesting points that are brought up in their argument. Firstly, we're told that in the journals and discoveries at Dar es Balat, in those writings, Leto II never once disparaged the Sisterhood as an organization.
Yeah.
He never condemned them explicitly. And that is a huge reason the Rakis priesthood, who of course treats Leto II as a god, has allied with, or at least is amicable and works with the Bene Gesserit, and is not openly hostile against them like they would be against someone like the Tleilaxu, which Leto II also hated.
Right.
Tuik also refers to Shiana as a quote-unquote latter-day Siona during this argument, which is very interesting, because this is very much parroting the words of Dromund, R.I.P., our guy Dromund.
Yeah, translated into the mouth of God, for sure.
Translated into the mouth of God for even daring to compare Shiana to Siona, but here is Tuik kind of mimicking his words here. We're seeing this legend around Shiana continue to build sort of in real time. We also see from their conversation how Jessica has been raised to this place of holiness. Quote, Reverend Mother Jessica to her son, Muad'Dib to his son Leto II, the holy triumvirate of heaven. End quote.
So interesting.
Wow. It's very much giving the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? Like Holy Trinity, the Holy Triumvirate. We see how Jessica has been canonized in this religion. It's super fascinating stuff. Also, you made an excellent point in our script here.
Yeah.
Consider the juxtaposition in how the Bene Gesserit view Jessica versus how the priesthood views Jessica.
Yeah.
Wild. One last thing we want to call out from this argument that Styros and Tuik have. Leto the Elder gets a name drop!
Yo, R.I.P. Leto the Elder.
Incredible.
Crazy. Yeah.
Styros
Yeah.
basically is suggesting that Leto 2 should actually be called Leto 3, right? Because aren't we forgetting that other Leto? Which is very much like what people on Reddit are always saying. Styros, clearly a Redditor. And yeah, I mean, like, this is wild. Of course, the priesthood has come up with some like convoluted ass way why that doesn't make sense, and the spirit of Leto the Elder was imbued in Leto 2, blah blah blah. They come up with some bullshit religious ass reason why Leto 2 is Leto 2, but it's very cool to see a name drop here for a very minor character that was all but forgotten from the first book.
Yeah. And again, I think there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, Frank forgot that he gave Paul a first son. And I'm like, book 5, Frank's tired of people mentioning this in the 80s. He's like, shut up about it. Yeah, he's there. He's real. All right, there, done.
Yeah, that's true.
You're Styros. You're going to die soon.
Right. Don't be a Styros.
Don't be a Styros. You're almost as bad as Korba.
All right, well, let's get to Styros' death here. Continuing with the summary, Tuik, after this annoying chat with Styros, suits up. He goes to meet with Shiana, who's on the rooftop. Up on the roof garden, she's hanging out there with some attendants, and she's in the middle of practicing some very suspiciously Prana Bindu-like finger exercises. And this conversation is very interesting and calls back to some really cool things from God Emperor, which you called out in our script here.
Yeah. I think in this conversation and generally in his reflections, it stuck out to me that Chenua, the Bene Gesserit we see marching alongside Leto 2 back on the bridge during that peregrination, and Leto going, you're going to die before you fully awaken as a Reverend Mother, but you're going to be remembered in hundreds of years. Here we are, thousands of years later, and we have the saintly Chenua, hell yeah, got her rightful place in the annals of history. But there's also this passage, which I thought was really interesting. Quote, the first high priest had constructed a logical account of how the holy Huineri, bride of God, had been a secret Reverend Mother. End quote. And I was so curious, or so interested by this, because we know that's not true.
Yeah.
We know that she had some Bene Gesserit training, but was by no means a Bene Gesserit, like, acolyte or Reverend Mother or whatever.
Yes.
And so my first thought was like, whoa, they fucking got that super wrong. Wow, that first high priest was an idiot, wasn't he? But then I realized, oh, you know what? That first high priest was probably put in place by the Bene Gesserit, and they almost certainly wanted to cement sort of an allegiance between the Bene Gesserit and the priesthood of Arrakis. And so they did.
Mm-hmm.
It's so cool. Plans within plans. And again,
plans within plans.
Masters of mythology, creating these incredible stories and allowing those things to be figured out by these people who are trying to negotiate with the Darius Balat texts, probably some of which say she's not a Bene Gesserit, and them going, Apocrypha, that's in the Apocrypha, that doesn't count.
Scratch
that. We've deduced logically that she was.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Oh, for sure. There's no way Leto didn't journal about how Hui was a Ixian creation with Tleilaxu tampering and Bene Gesserit training. And the Masters of Mythology over here decided to spin that in a way where they were the closest thing to God.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
The bride of God, the holy Huinori.
The truth sayer at the right hand of God, or whatever. Yeah, for sure.
Bene Gesserit at it again. You do love to see how effective they are at times. It's like juicy. You know, it's like so juicy to be like, damn, they're good. You gotta respect the game.
Yeah.
All right, let's end this chapter because holy fuck.
Yeah.
All hell breaks loose on this rooftop, folks. Kipuna throws Shiana over to Tuik because she sees something in the distance hurtling towards them, and she herself is killed by a Shiga wire, just shrink. And then Tuik rushes Shiana down a stairwell. He's full on panicking and luckily runs into a delegation of Bene Gesserit who just happen to be there, wonder why. This delegation, headed by none other than our girl Odrade.
Hell yeah.
Who quickly takes command of the situation. She immediately starts bossing folks around. The situation on the rooftop gets taken care of. Odrade ushers everyone into Shiana's room, and things seem to be under control. When they all look over and suddenly see a dead, naked Styros lying on the ground.
Yeah.
And this is when it's made clear to everyone that there was some sort of plot here to either kill or harm Shiana that very likely involved Ixians and face dancers. Now, the chapter ends as Odrade orders everyone out of the room so that she and Shiana can be alone. And Shiana clearly shaken up by this, but is beginning to calm down now that she's back in her room and seemingly safe. And with a Bene Gesserit, she kind of looks up at Odrade and is like, "Oh my gosh, you're a Reverend Mother, aren't you?
Yeah.
I've heard so much about you."
Yeah.
So that's a kind of a cute moment too. And clearly another example of seeds that have been planted for the past few years that are beginning to sprout. Shiana already has a positive association with the sisterhood and Reverend Mothers. And that's sort of the cliffhanger that we end this chapter and today's reading on. Odrade and Shiana meeting face to face. Okay, well, that wraps up our incredibly long and dense summaries here. Hope you enjoyed that, folks. Let's take a breather because, my God, there's still so much more to talk about. When we come back, we're getting into our takeaways. And then, of course, we'll wrap up the episode by chomping down on a little spice morsel we have cooking for you. We'll see you in a minute.
Welcome back, everybody. Hope you dodged the Seeker dragging a long trail of Shiga wire up in the roof garden. Getting into our takeaways today. Our first takeaway today is looking at Teraza's lesson that she delivers on the lighter to Gamu.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this moment where she's entering teacher mode. She's dropping a lesson on both Teg and Odrade, introducing one another, preparing them for whatever's going to happen later in the book, talking about different forms of tension that are building up, that sort of thing. She touches on 3 ideas that we wanted to look at, connecting them and calling back to them in turn. Dependency infrastructures, hydraulic despotism, again, not exactly water, and keylogs, again, kind of water.
Kind of water.
And these concepts apply both to Dune broadly and are kind of interesting to think about in terms of these familiar characters and events that we've been reading about the last 5 books, but also possibly hint at what's to come with the Honored Matre and maybe what else is going on right now in the Dune universe.
Yeah. These are certainly ideas we should keep in mind for the rest of the book.
For sure.
So let's start with dependency infrastructure. Teraza basically defines it for us. Quote, a term that includes all things necessary for a human population to survive at existing or increased numbers, end quote.
Right.
And Teg understands this. He's a Mentad. He didn't really need this 101 lesson on things like melange, food, water, breathable air, life, liberty, and taxes. You know, all of the things that society and humans need to continue existing, basically.
Right.
Those are dependency infrastructures. But I think what's more fascinating here is Odrade's thought as she's listening in on this, because she thinks, quote, love is a dependency infrastructure, end quote.
Yeah.
Woo!
A senior member of the Bene Gesserit is like, love is necessary for human populations to survive at existing or increased numbers.
Fascinating.
Especially fascinating when you then think about how the Bene Gesserit do not allow themselves love. Because if that is a dependency infrastructure for humanity, what does that mean about the Bene Gesserit? More on that later.
That's takeaway number 2.
That's takeaway number 2. Should have put that at the end.
So super interesting. This first concept basically is tangible things that humans need to survive and thrive and grow. Food, water, air.
Beer. Yeah.
Beer.
Yeah.
But also, based on Odrade's thought, these things are also intangible. It can be more cerebral things like love or, as we know, religion. Teraza herself touches on the idea of religion being an infrastructure that societies and cultures can come to depend on.
Indeed. So that carries us into our second idea, hydraulic despotism. Quote, central control of an essential energy, such as water, electricity, fuel, medicines, melange, obey the central controlling power, or the energy is shut off and you die. End quote. So we have levers, and many of these levers, as you can already see, are dependency infrastructures. These are the things necessary for human sustenance.
Yep.
And as a quick aside, this is a real concept, which is also referred to as hydraulic civilization. And it was sort of coined and explored by a writer, philosopher, anthropologist, Karl Wittfogel, in his book, Oriental Despotism from 1957. And as always, I was like, okay, checks out. The book is around when Frank is around. I'm not saying Frank read this book, but
the ideas existed.
They had been coined already. From Britannica, quote, wherever irrigation required substantial and centralized control, government representatives monopolized political power and dominated the economy, resulting in an absolutist managerial state. In addition, there was a close identification of these officials with the dominant religion and an atrophy of other centers of power. End quote. So to paraphrase that, widespread irrigation and these kind of big infrastructural programs often required some degree of like bureaucratic oversight. You had to have like governmental involvement, and those in those positions would often arrest power, especially if they had an army or a military to reinforce that power claim once they had it.
Yeah.
And Britannica does point out that there was some pushback on Wittfogel's ideas. He has very well talked about this one piece of how certain powers come to be and fails to take into consideration other more nuanced ideas. But he's still, people, even his harshest critics, are still acknowledging that he brings up some very good points about this one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
So,
right.
Very interesting. And again, feels so right at home in Dune, this idea of managerial absolutist states aligned with the dominant religion, with this atrophying of other major powers.
Yeah, I mean, that defines, that quote you just read basically just defines many of the overarching themes of Dune.
Yeah.
Religion, politics, riding in the same cart, et cetera, you know?
Yeah.
Stagnation, totally. The atrophying of other centers of power as power centralizes in just one place, being a bad thing, et cetera, you know?
Yeah.
All of these things we've talked about for hundreds of hours now. Very fascinating to see that these ideas are real and they exist.
If you go back to the first book of Dune, where like the major powers are the Landsraad, they're Chom, they're Ix, they're, you know, and then we get to Heretics, and we started this book going, we don't even know if the Landsraad exists anymore.
Right, who is around anymore?
Who's here? And as it turns out, it's the powers that have centralized. It's the Bene Gesserit, it's the Tleilaxu, both of whom have dependency infrastructures. They have control over certain elements of the universe.
Yeah, totally. It's very cool. Now, another idea that's also real, comes from real world examples, is this concept of keylogs.
Yeah.
Taraza rounds out this lesson that she's teaching with the idea of keylogs, and Odrade, this time, from her thoughts, we get the definition. Quote, when lumbermen sent their fallen timber rushing down rivers to central mill sites, sometimes the logs jammed up in the river, and an expert was brought in to find the one log, the key log, which would free the jam when removed. End quote.
Yeah.
Jenga.
Cool.
It's reverse Jenga. You know, you're finding the one piece that'll make the whole tower fall.
Yeah. Reverse Jenga. It's Jenga. Golf rules. First to drop the tower.
Right. It's street Jenga, you know? It's how we play it on the streets in Pakistan. Now, Taraza connects this to an interesting idea because she goes on to basically talk about Leto 2, the worm.
Yeah.
And how the worm made himself into humanity's key log. He himself jammed up the river.
Yeah.
For thousands of years. We read all about that in God Emperor of Dune. And then with his death, him being the key log, with his removal from the jam, humanity could once again flow unhindered, and the river of humanity's existence would continue rushing onward.
Yeah.
Very interesting connection to make there for Taraza.
Yeah. I also wanted to stress here, I didn't know about key logs, like again, color me ignorant about lumbermen.
You're not a lumberman?
I'm not a lumberman, as it turns out. I know.
But you're so tall.
I am so tall, just like lumbermen. And, you know, I'm so strong, just like lumbermen. But alas, it is all a facade.
Wow.
I know. You feel lied to. I appreciate that. I see tears in your eyes. Your humanity. You remember it. But I didn't know about key logs. I was trying to research them to like understand better. And key logging software has ruined the ability to research this in 2024.
Oh,
It's all programs and cloud computing and data and your key logs to make sure you like know how traffic's working and your all this junk.
oh, that's so funny.
But looking at the idea, I remember an interesting conversation about roles and professions that are immune to automation. Things like being a plumber, because being a plumber takes experience and intuition and also using lots of different tools, which is hard to make a multifaceted robot. Like we're very good at making a robot that screws really well, but making a robot that screws really well, but also loosens gaskets and also does this and also pulls that and also pushes that. Plumbers have a pretty good, deal for a bit.
Yeah.
And
so far.
We're coming for you, plumbers. All right.
You better watch out, plumbers.
Watch out, plumbers. Our computers are going to replace you one day. But looking at this, we have the idea of the experts brought in to break up these log jams does feel like the sort of thing that humans are good at doing that computers are bad at doing, which is applying experience and intuition. The same thing really that makes Mentats such a valuable resource in the Dune universe is their ability to make intuitive leaps from one datum to another compared to a machine or a computer that has to have it all laid out.
Yeah.
It feels so right in the Dune universe to talk about this. It feels so perfect to say, oh yeah, there are some problems that you have to bring in a person to understand the exact giving point, that exact moment, and how to apply that leverage.
That's an interesting read on it for sure. And again, all of these ideas not only tie with this story in Heretics of Dune, but they tie with God Emperor of Dune and Leto and the previous books, and then the overall Dune saga, and then on another meta level are also Frank philosophizing about his views. So there's definitely a lot to read into Taraz's lesson here.
So we've talked now about these three ideas. Let's bring it all together and let's kind of land this takeaway.
Yeah.
Because Taraza rounds out the lesson with an idea that, again, I think is really going to be important to keep in mind as we get further into this book, which is that some dependencies are fully constructed. Teg mentioned some earlier: water, spice, melange, breathable air. Sure, but some, perhaps religion, love, sexuality, some can be constructed. Quote, beyond the so-called natural dependencies are some religions that have been created psychologically. Even physical necessities can have such an underground component. End quote. So, something that comes to mind, the honored matre, using sexuality, using sex, this powerful primordial force, they are using that as a means of establishing worship.
Right.
Creating a natural dependency, creating this kind of, I don't know, it's almost like this offshoot of the love and vulnerability that Odrade experienced. They're tapping into that power, whatever that power is. But they take it too far, right? They place themselves at the center of worship. And the Bene Gesserit avoids this, of course. They avoid doing the same thing because, quote, worshippers and the worshipped are united by the faith. But once they are united, they can be divided. And once they're divided, quote, the divided forces will battle for supremacy, end quote. So the honored matre are trying to control the dividing forces. And as Teg computes, them playing with this fire and doing it this way could mean that much of humankind also gets burned and also gets dragged down with them if they fail, right?
Right. It's a dangerous tool to play with, and they don't quite know the safety instructions. They didn't read the whole manual, and the Bene Gesserit are like, they don't know the kind of the Pandora's box, the kind of destruction they could unleash with this kind of dependency, this kind of sexual dependency and worship that they are creating in all of the planets that they conquer as they make their way back from the scattering. That's like the heart of the warning and lesson that Taraza is trying to impart upon Teg and Odrade. And for us, the reader as well.
Yeah.
We're starting to learn, okay, Honored Matre is very dangerous, very
Totally.
scary, very sexy,
Yeah.
but also maybe a little not quite as self-aware as they need to be. The things they are doing can spectacularly backfire. And of course, the Bene Gesserit have been on the receiving end of things spectacularly backfiring on them
Very true.
for thousands of years. So they would be the best to know that treading lightly is oftentimes the best approach.
I wanted to point out that she gives the example of, I get the impression that throughout this conversation, she's saying to Teg and Odrade, there is about to be a seismic shift in the galaxy, and you need to be prepared. We have set up things. We, as the Bene Gesserit, have set up things that might be causing things to get jammed and to get locked up. So let me tell you about key locks. Let me tell you about this idea of finding that one thing that needs to be leveraged, and this is how things are going to work out. The one example she gives is Leto 2, one of the biggest impacts of humanity that has ever happened, ever.
Yeah.
The fact that she references the literal God Emperor who subjugated humanity for 3,500 years, I think gives us an idea of what stakes she's illustrating. She's saying this is the level that things are at. These are the stakes.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And that seems really notable in all of this. Like the Honored Matre are part of it for sure. But we're also doing quite a bit, us Bene Gesserit. And you need to be prepared to find that log or do your part in breaking that jam.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think she's making it clear the stakes that are at play here.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, there's some intense foreshadowing and hinting that things are about to change dramatically. And Odrade and Teg may find themselves at the center of it and need to have these lessons in mind if they are to make the right decisions going forward. Teraza very much acting as the mentor here for both of them.
Totally, yeah.
To wrap up this first takeaway, I did want to step out of the story for a second and just to express an opinion that I've certainly felt reading this book and again upon reread as we work our way through it. And I'm sure others have felt this as well. On a meta level, like, yes, all of these ideas are relevant to the story. Teraza setting plans in motion, teaching lessons. We're getting some great thematic alignment with the larger Dune saga, as we've discussed. But Frank is also just taking the opportunity here to get philosophical and political, as he did often in God Emperor of Dune through Leto's words.
Right.
And a critique I have of Heretics, it starts in God Emperor, but I think God Emperor is a little more justified in doing this. The critique I have of Heretics is Frank getting like sort of overly wordy and verbose. He'll spend like 30 pages talking about a concept or an idea or Teraza teaching a lesson. And I think part of what makes a lot of readers' eyes glaze over, and certainly mine, is a lot of this could just be explained in an email or could just be like way more direct. You know, we don't have to be so Bene Gesserit about this and so mysterious and elusive and manipulative. For example, Odrade constantly telling Teg, like, that's all I can tell you right now. You'll know when you know. Sorry, buddy. And it's like, okay, come on. Like, it's this like classic storytelling trope that we see in many stories, good and bad, where a character will like bury the lead or they will avoid saying the main thing right away so that we can create this like sense of mystery and drama. And if handled badly, it can come off as like pretty artificial and fake, you know, like think of every horror movie you've ever seen,
right.
You know, all it takes is for one character to be like, that guy has a machete. We should run in the opposite way.
Yeah.
It takes one guy to say one logical thing for an entire horror movie to fall apart. But then, of course, you lose all the mystery, drama, and fun of it. And so that storytelling trope can be used well, can be used not so well. And I think Heretics suffers from using this trope a little too much and justifying it as, oh, it's just a Bene Gesserit thing.
Yeah.
And then, alas, we're just like, the reader is kind of frustrated in the reading experience because you're like, okay, well, you just spent 30 pages talking about like effectively nothing and just like blue balling me on what's going to happen next. But I also want to acknowledge Frank is a master of his craft, as we know. He's a very experienced writer by this point. And we, the reader, it's still early in the book, don't know what the Bene Gesserit plan is yet.
Yeah.
We still have to suss that out, much like Teg, much like Duncan, much like Shiana. All of these players don't quite know how the plan will come together. Taraza maybe is the only one who knows the full picture.
Yeah.
And she's not telling us anything yet. So we have to trust Frank that, yes, he's doing some like blue balling here, but he's also perhaps laying the groundwork with these ideas. And hopefully these ideas will come back full circle later in the book. And it's just something we'll have to keep in mind and keep a lookout for as we keep reading.
Yeah, I keep returning to that feeling of like the feeling of I want things to happen on Arrakis. Like I want shit to happen with Shiana and nothing's happening and I don't like that feeling. We're in this chapter where everything could have been said in 3 sentences. And we're going, fucking come on, Taraza, speed it up. But we're also sitting with Teg and Odrade, both of whom are going, fucking Taraza, come on, speed it up. So it is funny to me because I think you right at the end there, I'm 100% on the same page. Like it gets very lecture-y and very soapboxy, and it's all very like, it's hard to tie to like, is any of this important? Should I be taking notes? Like, how well should I try my hardest to understand this, or should I just move on and hope that it makes sense later on?
Completely, yes.
But I also think that as Frank is exploring in this book, that aligns us with how Teg feels. That aligns us with how Odrade feels. The only person who knows more than we do in some ways is Taraza, and she's being so fucking annoying and so Bene Gesserit about it all. But that's also, this is the book where we're being encouraged to really look at the Bene Gesserit. We're given way more access to the sisterhood than we've ever had before, and we're asked to be critical of them and their ways. They are so obnoxious all the time. Oh my God. Now we know why Leto was always like, you are so fucking tiresome.
Right. It does make me think back to that Leto chapter where he meets with his sisters who try to poison him with the thing, you know? with the water
Spice
that
essence,
they try to get, the spice essence. And I so appreciate Leto just like cutting through the bullshit with the Bene Gesserit in that scene. Him just being like, hand over the spice essence. Let's just stop with this charade. You're absolutely correct. Like it's we're meant to be critiquing the Bene Gesserit sisterhood because now we're given access to how they operate on the inside. And so some of this feeling of frustration as a reader is certainly intentional. I just think that's
it's a dangerous game.
dangerous line to walk, right?
Yeah.
Because if you bore and annoy me enough, I will just stop reading your book.
Right, for sure. Yeah, we don't owe it to anybody to like, I do think that's also where his brilliance comes in though, because following this very frustrating, this is the longest string of chapters we had in this book yet, where we're stuck with 2 characters doing something, right?
Yeah, continuous.
We were Teg, then we were Teg and Taraza, now we're Teg, Taraza and Odrade, and then we're in the same fucking chapter, the same room for another chapter, and then we're back on Gamu in the same chapter. This is continuous. And then what does Frank do immediately after that?
Assassination.
Shigawire, people cut to pieces, craziness breaking out. Everything you said is totally valid. And I think people will read this book and be like, this is not for me. And that's totally valid. But I do think as I'm rereading this, I had a lot of those feelings the first time I read this. As I'm rereading it, I'm feeling a lot more of the like, oh my God, this is so tedious and this is so annoying. And is this another lecture and blah, blah, blah. And then this assassination attempt happens and I'm like, we're back in, baby. Like, and I think that's Frank knowing his sort of pacing and the rhythm of everything. So yeah. I think it's important we continue to have that conversation too. Of like,
I will be revisiting this a lot. I think
100%
throughout the book.
Good.
For sure.
And it'll be interesting to see, like, let's talk about the sort of feelings of frustration that we have now in 10 chapters or 20 chapters, whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We'll just have to keep all of this in mind, basically.
Yeah.
Let's talk about our second takeaway. This will be pretty quick, I think.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. And this is, are the Bene Gesserit human?
Whoa.
Yeah. But
this is the quick one, folks.
This is the quick one. And the answer is yes. Thanks for listening, everybody. So in Teg's Walk and Talk with Odrade, they discuss whether or not the Bene Gesserit fit within humanity after millennia of denying themselves some of the most human experiences. Tag reflects on the Reverend Mothers. Quote, they moved somehow outside the main flow, perhaps parallel to it, perhaps diving into it occasionally for their own purposes, but always removed from humankind. End quote. Again, like O'Drade gripping his arm, going, what a great father I have. She's playing the part. She's putting on the mask of humanity.
Yeah.
But is removed from those kind of familial relationships.
Yeah.
And Terraza does seem to be pretty self-aware about this, right? She is priming Teg to make some sort of big monumental decision for the Bene Gesserit.
Huge. This line caught me off guard. Yeah.
This is incredible. And also shows Terraza's understanding of the sisterhood and its weaknesses in some ways.
Yeah.
So this is Teg. Quote, I am to be the Bene Gesserit eyes, Teg said. Terraza wants me to make a human decision for all of you.
Whoa.
End quote.
Whoa.
Which is crazy.
Insane. And I think we do have to give credit. Obviously, we are going to spend a lot of this book critiquing the Bene Gesserit.
Yeah.
But credit where credit is due. They are self-aware enough, despite whatever shortcomings and dogmatic views they might have now, thousands and thousands of years into their organization. They are still self-aware enough to realize when they need an outsider like Teg, somewhat outsider like Teg,
Yeah.
to do a thing that they are incapable of because of the way they operate. I think among all of the groups in this universe, the Bene Gesserit are one of the most self-aware, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They are the ones who are least likely to delude themselves into thinking that they are infallible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, some of them, because again, we have Shuang Yu over here. Bing! Shuang Yu is like, I know better than the Reverend Mother Superior, and they're fucking up. And so you're right. Like Terraza, I think knows they're not
Yes.
infallible, and I think that's the brilliance of Terraza. And if someone else were Reverend Mother, like Reverend Mother Superior, if Shuang Yu became Reverend Mother Superior, she would perhaps guide the Bene Gesserit to be the sort of like, oh, I think you're hypocrites now, and you're totally not aware of your own biases and stuff like that. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. But I would imagine someone like Shuang Yu rarely, if ever, makes it to the highest halls
True.
of power.
True. Yeah.
And it really does take like a sharp mind like Terraza to get there. But you're absolutely correct. This is really a huge compliment for Terraza,
right,
and the way she's operating. It's very difficult to do, right? Like when you are in charge of something and that something is your life, the huge blind spot in your thinking is that thing, because you've now invested so much of yourself in it,
right,
in the
yeah.
organization, in the idea, in the book you're writing, in the whatever, you know? And being your own harshest critic is actually a really tough thing to do. I know people joke about it all the time, you know, LOL, I'm my own harshest critic, but actually critiquing yourself in a way that is painful, I think I would wager most people don't do and can't do. And so I do want to hand it to Terraza. She's looking at this organization that has been her whole life and going, Miles has to be the one to make this huge decision for us because we are incapable of doing it. Crazy.
Yeah. It's wild. It absolutely is. Yeah.
Now, continuing with this idea, O'Drade Teg talking about whether the Bene Gesserit are human, Teg has a bunch of thoughts, and he then, as we stated earlier in the summary, immediately shares them with O'Drade just openly.
Yeah.
And O'Drade's reaction, so fascinating. She immediately becomes defensive, brings up the Spacing Guild, blah, blah, blah. And inwardly, we are told that she's kind of hurt by this, actually, by Teg's words and by his view of the sisterhood, and in particular, his view of her.
Mm-hmm.
And she thinks back to a painting that's in Terraza's office or something. And looking at this painting, this Van Gogh painting, is one of the only times she feels truly connected to her humanity. Her thoughts wander back to that painting in sort of a reaction and rejection of what Teg is telling her. Teg is saying, Bene Gesserit, you're so inhuman. And she's like, well, no, I'm not, because I look at that painting and I feel things. I can't be inhuman. That painting makes me feel very human things.
I also, I think there's a few different explanations for how Van Gogh's, literally the most unbelievable thing, that Van Gogh's painting is alive.
Survived over 30,000 years.
40,000 years and is in Terraza's office. Bullshit.
Get the fuck out of here.
But I was thinking, it's like, okay, let's try to create an in-universe explanation. And one explanation that I came up with is that the art that we see today and the art that we have access to in museums and that people are making today is profound and will still be 30,000 years, 40,000 years from now, will still be incredible examples of what humans are capable of. And it would have been easy for him to create maybe an artwork and just explain, oh, it makes you feel very human. It was made by some Ikazian painter. A lot of authors would be very tempted to reinforce their world building with some in-universe artist or whatever that makes us feel like the universe is more vast and everything. But it seems notable that perhaps it is a modern day work of art that has survived and not some invented piece of art from the 30,000 years. Maybe in this universe where everyone's worried about being assassinated and with Shiga wires and seekers and all sorts of plans within plans, maybe the proliferation of art isn't happening as widely and the same sorts of the same caliber of art isn't happening. Also similar to Leto thinking back about Bach, right? Trying to use these in-universe explanations.
And with Leto, we have a very clear in-universe explanation because other memory, he just taps into his memory and replays Bach. Here, you're right, it's a little tougher to come up with an in-universe explanation why this painting survived 35,000 years or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is sort of like classic us. You definitely always reach for the in-universe explanation for something, and that's always super fascinating to explore. In this instance, I didn't feel the need to do that. I read the Van Gogh reference, and I was like, okay, a lot of writers do this. Frank himself has done this throughout the Dune saga many times. Implanting a modern-day reference that your readers now, in 1981, will understand is a classic storytelling device, even if it doesn't make sense. In particular, a lot of sci-fi stories will do this. And for me, I was like, okay, this is Frank using shorthand to just get the idea across more clearly.
Right.
It's the same thing as Paul comparing himself to Hitler. How the fuck does anyone remember Hitler 30,000 years in the future?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. We need to know that Paul is Space Hitler. So Frank makes it explicitly clear by making that comparison.
Yeah.
And I think in this instance, the point that Frank is trying to make very clear to us and make sure that the reader doesn't miss is that great art connects all of us to our humanity.
Yeah.
Just as it does for Audrade when she looks at a Van Gogh painting.
Right.
I certainly found your in-world theory interesting, and it's always fun to try and connect those in-lore dots. But in this instance, I just brushed it away. I didn't give it a second thought.
Yeah, that's fine. Ultimately, again, no wrong way to approach reading a book.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoy the sort of let's try to rationalize this and explain, even if it means busting out the tinfoil hat.
Exactly.
But you're right. I think the key there is connecting with humanity. And getting back to this kind of broader conversation, Teg also draws a comparison that I think is really appropriate here, where he is looking at the Reverend Mothers and how they handle humanity and how they're involved with it or are not, are separate from it or not. And he compares them to Leto too. Quote, "It was an identifying mark of the Reverend Mother, a sense of extra identity that made them closer to the long-dead tyrant than to the human stock from which they sprang.
Whoa.
Manipulation. That was their mark. They manipulated everyone and everything." End quote.
And everywhere and all at once.
Everything, everywhere, all at once. Great movie. Yeah. But yeah, we see in God Emperor of Dune, initially it's Duncan who denies Leto his place among humanity.
Yeah.
And Leto is frustrated by this. We get this little quote. "He held on to the remnants of his once human self with a grimness which could not be denied." End quote. So even in that moment, he's acknowledging, yes, I've lost some part of my humanity. And toward the end, in his conversations with Siona, when he's in the desert in the Sarir, he's like, my lost humanity, right? He cultivates sympathy with her, going, I had a hunger for food that I couldn't eat. And now I think that hunger is a hunger for my lost humanity.
Yeah.
And it's this painful awareness of what he traded for the ability to guide our species to survival, right?
Exactly.
That's the cost. That's the cost he paid.
Mm-hmm.
So comparing the two, the thought that sort of began to form for me is that it is possible on sort of a, again, 50,000 year timeline, the Bene Gesserit has made a similar organizational sacrifice to Leto.
Mm.
They have decided in their bureaucracy, in their training, they have decided to coach their sisters out of these very human experiences, denying themselves love, a natural dependency, by removing themselves from this thing that they admit, Odrade admits, is necessary for humanity to continue at its current level or to grow. It's interesting. Leto was very distinctly aware of the cost that he paid. It does not seem like the Sisterhood is as aware of that piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, it's very Jedi coded. It's very, there's this like misinterpretation of monks where it's like, oh, well, they release and disconnect from their humanity and find quote unquote inner peace, which of course lacks the nuance of that. But that's like sort of the pop culture TV version of a monk, right?
Totally. Yeah.
It's this idea that to tap into greater powers, you have to disconnect from some part of your humanity. And I love this analysis you've got here of Leto 2 and him tapping out of his humanity and the way that the Bene Gesserit organization has perhaps made a similar sacrifice over the course of their entire existence, letting go of parts of their humanity in order to not just obtain astounding abilities like the voice, but also to guide humanity toward a better future, just like Leto 2 is doing. It's fascinating. I also wonder what it says on a meta level about, like, do you have to give up parts of your humanity in order to do good or in order to do better? I don't necessarily think Frank is saying that, but certainly some of the characters in this universe might think along those lines.
Yeah, I think that the distinction here is going to be if you're acting for your own, within your own kind of cosmos as an individual, or if you're attempting to steer the entire species. And I think the point you would be able to construct by looking at all the datum is like, if you intend to shift the course of humanity, you have to give up a lot. And you have to be willing to give up a lot to even have the ability to do any of that. Otherwise, the characters that we see most like sympathetically are the ones like Hui Nari, who's just, I don't know. I feel like there's the individual scale. There's plenty of room to be human and to be in love and to let love guide you and to do all these nice things.
I think on a human scale, yes. I think on an institutional scale, Paul, the emperor of the galaxy, head of a household, Lisan Algave, Messiah of the Fremen, did let love guide him down a path that ultimately resulted in him kicking the can down to his son because he wasn't able to see it to the finish line. And love was the thing that he was struggling with the whole time. Love versus his responsibility as a leader of, in that instance, the entire empire.
Yeah.
So maybe there's an idea like your humanity is like only so relevant until you are gobbled up into a larger institution, and then until like the institutions can't have humanity because they're institutions, and so once as you are operating within them and working your way up them at a certain level of power, the needs of the institution come before the needs of your humanity. Maybe that's sort of a half-formed thought.
Yeah,
that I'll have to ponder more on, but I think there's perhaps some seeds of that here in this idea with Teg and whether the Bene Gesserit are still even human anymore.
Yeah. That social construct. What do you have to rein in if you want to be a part of society? And then what does that look like?
Totally.
But anyway, clearly we want to add another 7th and 8th and 9th takeaway to this episode.
Yeah.
All of this to say, this humanity conversation is, this could be an argument for sympathy for the Bene Gesserit. Let's be sympathetic to the fact that they are, without even putting a name to it, giving up these key dependencies that most humans take for granted. Nevertheless, this could also be another way in which they're unaware and hypocritical. I suspect someone like Teraza is aware, and that's why she's okay with Odrade having this very important role, even though Odrade is still someone who maybe has this Bene Gesserit-like attachment to love, her initial foster parents, and that first person that she seduced. Nevertheless, the Bene Gesserit as an institution, as we're talking about, they demand a certain sacrifice, and that sacrifice is intense.
Definitely.
Okay, we have a spice morsel for you before we wrap up. But first, we're going to take a quick break. So, dear listener, do not go anywhere. We got to tell you about No Ships. We'll be right back right after this.
Welcome back, folks. Let's wrap up today's episode with one very juicy and nutritious spice morsel.
Yeah, let's do it.
No Ships. Let's talk about them.
Yeah.
This morsel is actually inspired by one of our patrons.
Yeah, unfortunately.
This patron's username is Rivers and Roads, and they shared how recently they were trying to look up some information on No Ships as they're reading Heretics along with us on the show here.
Yeah.
And stumbled onto some major Heretics of Dune spoilers in an attempt to learn about No Ships. So consider this part morsel and part PSA, folks.
Yeah.
It's dangerous out there.
Yeah.
These books have been around for decades, which means everything about them is all over the internet. And Googling something like No Ships could result in huge spoilers. If you're reading along with us for the first time, be wary.
Yeah.
And also, if you're a patron and you're in the Discord, our Discord is a safe, spoiler-free space to ask questions like that. Just look for the appropriate channel for Heretics of Dune and ask away. Everyone in our community is very good about keeping spoilers.
Totally.
Okay, so let's talk about these No Ships, though, for folks who are wondering and are now terrified to type that into Google.
Yeah. Yeah.
No Ships, like the No Rooms that we've heard about ever since God Emperor of Dune, are ships that are invisible to prescient beings and are basically impossible to track at a distance with any known technology in the universe.
Right.
Although, we do know that if you can, like, literally look at one, they're not, like, invisible. Right? You can, when they're in standby mode, when they're, like, literally physically right in front of you, you can see them.
Yeah.
So, like, if you were close enough in space to somehow be able to spot a ship off in the distance, you could see it, even if it didn't show up on your radar or any of your equipment.
Right. So if you like parked your No Ship going into Target, you don't have to go out into the boop boop trying to find it just through
right, exactly. Oh fuck, was it lane
God.
G or lane F? God damn it.
Oh no, where's my No Ship? I gotta get home.
Yeah. So they aren't invisible, but they are basically undetectable through technology and, probably more importantly, through any sort of prescience.
Right.
Now, another cool fact about No Ships is that they can perform what is effectively instantaneous transmission from one galaxy to the next, and they can do this miraculously without the need for guild navigators. Although, this does mean they're really skirting the lines of the Butlerian Jihad here.
Yeah.
They're using technology that is just close enough to being illegal and immoral in this universe. But alas, this is a very convenient piece of tech, and they're like, shit, we got to use these No Ships, so we can maybe ignore the finer points here.
It's sort of a common pattern, right? Of like, well, if it's useful enough, we'll like come up with a weird explanation for why it fits. You know, it's like,
exactly.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Totally. Now, obviously, ships like this that are completely undetectable on scanners are super useful in a military context. So we're told that they're often used for planetary defenses. They can also be armed with weapons to initiate combat. And that is a game changer.
Yeah.
Quote, The existence of no ships raises the possibility of destroying entire planets without retaliation. End quote.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's so scary.
That's huge. And again, seemingly this piece of tech that so far has just been in the background of the story has fundamentally reshaped this universe.
And as a final note here, we are already seeing the no ships playing a central role in this universe. This is not an inconsequential development of something like a robo table. This is a central element of the grand Cheops match that is underway across the universe.
Yeah.
Recall that Waff learns that the Honored Matre are right this second trying to find a way of nullifying the undetectability of no ships.
Huge.
And thinks to himself quietly, oh yeah, just like the Bene Gesserit are.
Ooh.
Crazy. So we are seeing an arms race between the big factions of the Dune universe attempting to find a way to nullify no ship invisibility. And the first person who does, make no mistake about it, is going to have a major advantage. No ships are the best way to sneak around.
Mm-hmm.
As we can see, they're a great way of disposing of bodies. Let's get this no ship out of here and no one's ever going to find it.
That's right.
And they are a very powerful card in everyone's deck of cards that they can play at any time.
Right. Pot of Greed, Monster Reborn, no ships.
Exodia.
That's the power ranking. Oh, and then Exodia down there somewhere too.
Yeah. Blue Eyes White no ship.
The 4 Yu-Gi-Oh nerds who listen to this just... I hope y'all enjoyed that.
Yeah.
There is a deep love of Yu-Gi-Oh somewhere in my heart, and I rarely get to express it these days.
I have to send you a TikTok I found that explores there are full character arcs that exist purely in the art of the cards, where a character started as like a small character and then later is introduced, and then there's like a shield bash, and then people are fighting and you see him, and you can actually create this incredible deep lore conversation. It's really cool. I'll send it to you.
Pokemon could never
in a fucking million years. Pot of Greed! Okay, folks, before we get too distracted, we've got some homework for you. And this homework is different than our normal book club homework because, dear listener, our next episode is a mailbag.
What?
So, if you're a patron, please send us your questions and thoughts via email, gomjabarpodcast@gmail.com, or on Discord as soon as possible, because we're going to answer some questions. We're going to talk about your questions in the next episode. So send them to us. Now, listen, if you are hearing my voice right now on the public feed, and there was like an ad earlier, we recorded this episode like 36 years ago. So your questions, they are interesting. Send them to us, gomjabarpodcast@gmail.com. And we will, if that's a good question, we will do our best to address them in the next public mailbag episode.
For sure. Okay, that wraps up today's episode.
Easy.
Hey, before we let you go, super quick, couple of reminders. The 2 best ways to support us on this show is to become a patron and to check out our Dune-themed swag on our merch store. Links to Patreon and the merch store can be found in the show links below. So go check them out and help us keep the show running.
Indeed. And finally, we love to hear from you. So whether you're sending us a question you had about the reading, or you're just saying how you're feeling, are you feeling as frustrated as Abu, or are you just enjoying the ride? Let us know. gomjabarpodcast@gmail.com. What do you think of the Bene Gesserit? They still human? Yes or no? Tell us. Send us your thoughts, your questions. If you have cute pets, send them. If you have ugly pets, send them. Who cares?
Send them.
We want to see your pets. They're cute.
We just want to see the pets.
And that's our episode.
That's the episode.
Oh my God. 2 hours, 14 minutes.
Woo!
Woof. Bing. Well, friends, there is no real ending. It's just the place where you stop the recording. But this podcast is always one step beyond logic. So help spread the word of Muad'Dib and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And be sure to check out the other shows on the Lore Party Podcast Network on loreparty.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at lore_party. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, whoever controls the podcast controls the universe. We'll see you on the Golden